Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Joseph Hammer and I'm an assistant professor of counseling psychology here at the University of Kentucky in the College of Ed. Today I wanted to share with you something that I wrote late in my doctoral training that reflected what I came to understand about myself as a cultural being in terms of how aspects of my privilege connected to my whiteness, socialized ways of being connected to my masculinity, and other aspects of me over time have shaped me into this person who has certain strengths and certain weaknesses, specifically weaknesses that can push others away interpersonally and that can lead me to have less satisfying interpersonal relationships than I otherwise might. And my desire to share this is that a lot of times in my training, I found that my professors and supervisors were comfortable talking about abstract concepts like privilege and things like that in the general sense, but weren't always grounding discussion of these things in their own personal experience in a way that made it very real and tangible and concrete. And I think that can be really helpful when professors do that, so I want to do that here. And I have worked through these personal, professional issues enough where I'm at a point where I feel comfortable talking about them openly with people and want to be able to model that. So as a caveat, I'm going to talk about some of these difficulties that I've had due to how I've been socialized, with the understanding that these are things that I've learned to manage adaptively and well. Because like you may have discovered so far about your own clinical growth edges, that your most deep-seated ones oftentimes will never go away completely. It's something that you always have to keep diligently working at and manage it well, and that's what health and competence and professionalism means. Not that it totally goes away, but that you manage it really well. So that's how I look at these issues, is that I manage them pretty well these days. And so I want to openly talk about them. So I'm going to read from you some excerpts from this self-reflection paper I did late in my doctoral training that Dr. Mei-Fen Wei, a professor of mine at Iowa State University, had us do. She is really good at helping people look at their own interpersonal patterns, how they're playing out, and what they can do to more mindfully manage them to create harmony with those around them. So, here we go. Over the course of my development at Iowa State, there are a number of problematic patterns I have identified within myself. I'm seeking to find the most central pattern of which all or most of my patterns connect. I believe that my fear of interpersonal rejection is my most central pattern. In this self-reflection paper, I will describe this core pattern and how my secondary patterns connect to it, providing examples of how this core pattern has played out inside and outside of the training environment. Next, I will use my integrated ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, EFT, emotion-focused therapy, theoretical orientation to conceptualize my core pattern. Last, I will draw upon my integrated orientation to describe the strategies that I use to manage my pattern and how these strategies have created positive change for myself. I, like all people, want to be connected to others, want to feel connected to others. I feel most alive when I grow in meaningful relationships with those around me. Because I value relationships so deeply, my greatest fear is being rejected by other people. Furthermore, I live with implicit assumptions that personal vulnerability opens me to the hurt of interpersonal rejection, and thus personal vulnerability is to be avoided at all costs. Said another way, I implicitly believe that if I avoid personal vulnerability, showing other people my vulnerable side, I cannot be rejected, or more accurately, I won't feel the sting of being rejected if it occurs. Personal vulnerability means showing my full self, my strengths and my weaknesses, my socially acceptable parts and my socially unacceptable quirks, my thoughts and my emotions to others. It is the capacity to be hurt through some form of rejection. Given this, my fear of rejection is closely tied to my fear of experiencing the sorrow and loneliness that can accompany rejection. My fear of rejection and vulnerability has a number of intra and interpersonal consequences. Lost my place. Which can be labeled my secondary patterns. These patterns have all been brought to my awareness by those involved in my clinical training and sometimes by my family and friends. I'll briefly touch on each. First, I'm driven to demonstrate my competence to myself and to other people. I implicitly believe that if I can demonstrate competence, people will want to connect with me. If I'm good enough at stuff, people will like me. More importantly, I believe implicitly that I can earn this connection without having to be vulnerable. I don't have to expose myself and put trust in other people to build that connection. My perfectionism, which I have a strong perfectionist streak, developed from this competence need. If I'm perfectly competent, this will guarantee connection. If I'm really good at stuff, consistently, people can't help but like me and want to spend time with me. That's the implicit message. Not very rational, but when our mind's rational, right? These secondary patterns show themselves in the excessive amount of time I spend on practicum class assignments and preparing for client sessions, my desire to take copious notes in all clinical settings, and my desire to show clients, supervisors, and instructors how good I am at conceptualization or other aspects of professional practice. And maybe as I describe some of this, maybe some of this sounds familiar to some of you listening to this. Furthermore, my perfectionism leads me to be internally self-critical of my academic efforts and time management. In particular, I'm highly concerned with efficiency, and this can lead me to overplan for activities and make me generally inflexible. On another note, I am more hesitant to take clinical risks, such as trying a new intervention that I'm less familiar with, for fear that I might appear incompetent. Again, it might sound familiar to some of you. This is also reflected in my personal life, where I hesitate to try new pursuits for fear of appearing novice. So I would hesitate to try a new hobby or even a new board game or something silly like that, because I feared not knowing what I was doing or looking stupid. It's so silly, but again, we're irrational beings sometimes, right? Second, my fear of rejection and vulnerability drives me to present as stoic. And if you saw my other video on masculinity and stoicism and how it shows up clinically, you'll have heard some of this. Growing up, I inherited the cultural belief that a worthwhile male, a real man, does not show certain emotions like sadness, fear, anxiety, vulnerable, empathetic warmth, and compassion. You can certainly show anger. Anger is culturally acceptable because it's a strong emotion, but these other vulnerable emotions, not so much. My whole life, I have been practicing disconnecting from and masking these vulnerable emotions, and thus an essential part of my clinical training has been relearning how to connect, experience, show, discuss, and symbolize, put a name to these emotions. I implicitly believe that my stoicism, not being affected by or showing vulnerable emotion, is how I define that, believe that my stoicism protects me from vulnerability. My stoicism is reflected in my efforts to hide my sadness, anxiety, or shame from clinical supervisors and instructors, and my unease and uncertainty with deepening emotional exploration in session with my clients. Again, for some of you, this may sound familiar. Likewise, my tendency to intellectualize is a byproduct of my stoicism. This also impacts my friendships and romantic relationships, in that I'm more hesitant to open myself up emotionally to others. Let's see. This intellectualization has limited the level of intimacy that I might achieve in my friendships and my romantic relationships. And this in particular, looking back on my early doc years, is something I feel very positive about, that I have very much grown around this. And this is one of the reasons I love counseling psych so much, is because it's the intersection of personal and professional is so strong. in that these things I was learning through my clinical training about how I manage my own emotions and vulnerability, when I started to learn how they impacted my clinical work, and I started to target the root of that, it ended up making my personal life more fulfilling. And so for some of you may be in a similar boat depending on how you've been socialized. I found that when I started practicing vulnerability with people I could trust, when I started practicing vulnerability and letting go some of that stoicism, my relationships became that much richer in a give and take. People felt more comfortable with me. They felt more close with me. And this was especially important in my romantic relationships, because that's something my partners really wanted from me, and it really helped me be a better partner to them. So one of the reasons I really love this profession is that I honestly feel like it has made me a better version of myself. And that weaknesses and that stoicism and stuff still, as I mentioned earlier in this video, lurks with me. It's still in here as my default, but I'm much better at mindfully managing that so I can behave and be the type of person I want to be. So that's the intellectualization. And if you see my other videos or know of me in person, I use highfalutin terms and big vocabulary words. And it's part of this kind of intellectual, philosophical presentation where I'm very intellectualized and try and appear intelligent. Again, it feeds into that demonstrating competence. If I'm very intellectual, I'm trying to show my competence and prove to people that I'm smart and stuff like that. So I have to be mindful of that intellectualization because it can kind of create this rift from people. My stoicism has also led me to present as formal. I grew up in a cultural environment where competence is equated with formal professionalism, and thus formal professionalism becomes a marker of competence in my mind. However, my formality can make it more difficult for others to connect with me, and this has been brought to my attention by staff at the Iowa State Counseling Center. I remember getting feedback from multiple people multiple times, and it took me several years to work on this, is that I seemed overly formal, and it was hard to connect with that, hard to kind of know what I was thinking. Lastly, closely connected to my formality and my stoicism is my enigmatic presentation, the kind of mysterious, hard to read. When I withhold my emotional experience from others and maintain a formal professionalism, others find me hard to read. I believe people are driven to understand and form an opinion about the individuals they meet, and when I withhold the rich detail that emotional expression and disclosure, especially nonverbal emotional expression, can provide, people are left wondering what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling. They don't know what's going on because I've got this stoic thing going on, formal, hard to read, intellectualized, and it's hard to know where I'm at. It can make people feel uncomfortable. And perhaps the most shameful and difficult byproduct of this enigmatic presentation is the following. This enigmatic presentation can make me come across as aloof, arrogant, haughty, proud. Depending on what the given individual knows about me from prior experience and their own personal tendencies, they may or may not know how to interpret that stuff. They may know, oh, he's not actually aloof and arrogant, it's just how he's coming across because of these stoic pieces. But people who don't know me, who don't have that context, who I'm meeting for the first time, where they don't have a lot of, they don't know that whole story about me, may interpret it in that way. And of course, you don't want people thinking that you're aloof and arrogant. That's not going to win you friends, right? That's not a good thing. So I got that feedback from staff at Iowa State University's Counseling Center. They said, Joe, you can kind of come across as aloof and arrogant sometimes. And that, when I got that feedback the first time, I felt so ashamed. It's such an icky feeling if you've ever been shamed in front of people, and you know the heaviness and the heat and just how that feels in your body. It's a nasty feeling, right? It's like, it felt so stigmatized. It felt so bad to me to get that feedback, and it was such important feedback to get, because if I was giving people that impression, that's not good. I need to correct that. I need to change that. And so I think for a lot of you watching, this is a less common growth edge, but some people do have it. So some people will have a similar experience to me. So if it all sounds familiar, it seems to connect to something in your personal life, you're not alone in this. And I hope this helps you think about the possibility of wanting to work on this directly. So at this point in the paper, I transitioned to talking about conceptualizing from an ACT and EFT integrated perspective, this personal stuff about me. From my integrated ACT EFT perspective, my pattern of fear of rejection and vulnerability can be conceptualized as a combination of cognitive fusion, which is an ACT thing, experiential avoidance, which is an ACT thing, and unworkable action, which is also an ACT thing. First, I'm fused with beliefs and rules regarding connection, vulnerability, emotion, competence, etc. For example, I'm often caught up in the belief that showing vulnerability, such as through emotional expression, is bad and not worth the risk. Second, I'm driven to avoid experiencing feelings of vulnerability in my day-to-day life. For example, I am afraid of having to make room for vulnerable emotions like sadness or emotional pain. This is where my tendency to intellectualize in order to avoid distress can hamper interpersonal connections. Third, I tend to engage in unworkable action, for example, withdrawing from people and situations where my personal vulnerability would be required or invited. These three aspects of my experience block me from allowing vulnerability and the possibility of rejection, which is necessary if I wish to build deep connections with other people. And that's a take-home thing that, as you probably know, if you want to grow closer to people, you have to be willing to take some risks. You have to be able to put yourself out there in that relationship at some point after getting to know them initially. To grow deeper in that relationship, you have to tell them some personal things. You have to admit to some things. You have to be vulnerable. You have to risk being rejected, telling them something that may be shameful or a little private or sensitive, and the possibility of them being like, haha, you're stupid, which of course no good friend would do, right? But we still can be socialized to fear that. And so my own fear of being vulnerable stopped me from achieving as deep of relationships as I wanted. It stunted that in a way. I didn't really use much EFT for this. So to increase the EFT portion of this conceptualization, one of the things that EFT talks about is this emotion completion cycle, where in a healthy, emotionally attuned human being, an emotion can arise, the person will notice the emotion, can feel comfortable allowing it to be, can put a name or symbolize, oh, this is sadness that I'm experiencing, to be able to express it, and if it's a primary adaptive emotion, being able to take the action that helps resolve that emotion. So when we feel sadness, that can be a sign to us that we need to recede and either spend some personal time with ourselves to recuperate or to draw in compassion and connection from other people. I'm hurting, I'm really sad, romantic partner, can you please comfort me? That's the implicit message, that it can bring in soothing or help us kind of recede within ourselves to a bit to recuperate. That's the adaptive action that's supposed to come with sadness. Just like with anger, when we experience anger, anger is designed from an evolutionary perspective to help us maintain boundaries, to help us maintain safety, to push back against people who violate our rights or who hurt us and say, no, that's not okay, back off, I deserve to be respected, you don't deserve to malign me in this way. So anger has that adaptive tendency to push back. And other emotions can have adaptive action tendencies like that too. So for me, from an EFT perspective, a lot of times when it came to vulnerable emotions, I would try not to allow them to be. I would try and bottle them or push them away or disconnect from them. And I certainly wouldn't let it get to the next step where maybe I would verbalize or admit to some of those vulnerable feelings. So my emotion completion cycle was breaking down at that point. So that would be an EFT portion of conceptualization about myself. Okay, then, last part, promise. In this, I now turn to talking about strategies for dealing with this stuff adaptively. I have used several strategies stemming from my theoretical orientation, or my integrated treatment approach, to manage my fear of vulnerability and rejection. I will discuss 3 strategies and give an example of each. First, I have learned mindfulness techniques to allow me to defuse, to get some healthy separation from my rigid beliefs and rules around connection, vulnerability, and emotion. As a result, when I have the thought like, I don't know how to help this client more deeply explore this emotion, I'm now more likely to treat that thought as just a thought rather than a threat that must be taken seriously and worried about. So from an ACT perspective, diffusion means to treat thoughts as just thoughts, not as commandments, edicts, something I need to take really, really seriously. So because all this stuff around stoicism and vulnerability has been so deeply socialized into me my whole growing up life, you can't get rid of it. It's kind of in my neurons, really deep-seated. And so thoughts, automatic thoughts, from a CBT perspective, are always popping up into my head in certain situations where vulnerability is a theme. I'm always having these thoughts unbidden pop up and say, Joe, be careful, this person can hurt you, or don't admit to that, or don't show this vulnerable emotion, you might get hurt, it's a risk. Those thoughts always pop up. And diffusion is noticing, hey, these thoughts are popping up, trying to push me around and bullying me to do stuff and to take a default course of action. But in this case, I can actually trust this person. So I'm not going to take that thought that I need to run and hide too seriously. I can have that thought, it can be there. Thank you, brain, for trying to help me out, I appreciate it. But I'm going to treat that thought as just a thought. I'm not going to be fused with that thought. So what next? Second, I have become more comfortable with the practice of accepting and making room for my vulnerable emotions as they arise in the moment, in my moment-to-moment awareness. As a result, when I feel sorrow well up inside me, I'm more willing to honor it and to show my tears to the people who are there. So one of the things I've really worked on since my graduate training and moving forward is allow myself to sit with and feel that sadness and just show it to other people, because that can bring connection. You've probably been in a situation where you've been with a friend or a partner, someone you trust, and when they became sad or vulnerable and showed that vulnerability and that, not, see my socialization saying weakness, but that vulnerability, that sensitivity, chances are with that person you felt kind of honored. You felt like, wow, this person is willing to show me their vulnerability. That's a risk. I really appreciate that. They trust me enough to take off the armor in front of me. And you probably felt closer to that person, felt honored in that show of emotion. And that's a common thing we tell clients who break down in tears or show sadness or vulnerability in session. They're like, oh, you probably think I'm a hot mess and stupid person. And we normalize, right? We say, no, I actually feel really honored that you feel safe enough to disclose that sadness to me. Or sit with that, right? That's what we say, and it's true, usually. So that was something I knew more and more as I worked on this personal part of myself, and so was able to practice vulnerability, to open myself up to those emotions more, both in my professional life in the room and personally, which was very beneficial to me. Almost there. Third, due to my increased diffusion and acceptance, I'm more willing to take committed action toward my meaningful goal of social connection, even though it means enduring some potential discomfort along the way. As a result, in these moments when I feel a deep sense of gratitude and connection to my romantic partner, for example, I'm more likely to make room for my anxious feelings about being vulnerable and at the same time directly express to her how much she means to me, which helps me create a deeper connection with her. So in this case, committed action from an ACT perspective is about allowing difficult thoughts and feelings to be there, because again, we can't stop them from showing up. Life happens to us and this stuff gets triggered. We don't ask for the thoughts and the difficult feelings to show up. They will. What's important is not whether we have them or not. It's what we do with them once they show up. Do we fight? Do we struggle? Do we push away? Do we take them really seriously? Or do we allow them to be? Do we make room for them, right? And if any of you who are familiar with mindfulness, this is, obvious, right? So by allowing myself to make room for those thoughts of, oh, don't be vulnerable, don't show that vulnerability, and the feelings of anxiety that come with that fear of, oh my God, what if they reject me, is practicing willingness to sit with that stuff and still behave, still do the things I want to do that I know will bring me the connection that's so important. So I have the anxious thoughts and feelings and still say something like, I really appreciate our relationship. I really like how you do X. I feel really close and comfortable with you. Thank you for being my partner. Something like that. It's a pretty vulnerable thing to say. You could get rejected pretty heavy if the person doesn't feel the same way, but that sort of statement to somebody can help us grow closer together, which is important because I, like all of us, I think, want that connection. So that doing that committed action of doing what will help you live in accordance with your values, that's what committed action is all about. So that's it. So I hope this wasn't the most boring thing ever reading through it, because I tried to elaborate on it, but it felt important to share this part of myself. This itself, sharing this on a video that's supposed to be posted publicly on the internet for anybody to make fun of me around, is itself a vulnerable act. So it's a part of my committed action of wanting to model this thought process and growth process, and to pay it forward and help make it more concrete to people, to ground it in my own real life professional personal experience. And again, I feel really good about the growth and the strides I've made around these socialized growth edges or weaknesses that I have, but it's going to continue to be a growth edge the rest of my life. Sometimes I have situations where I still am too perfectionist, too stoic, too aloof. I can still sometimes come across as arrogant, and it's really embarrassing, and it has embarrassed me in a number of contexts, which maybe I'll talk about at some point. But man, what a ton of life lessons has been around this. But I'm so happy that I have grown in the ways that I have, and I still have, and will for the rest of my life, have more growth to do. And that's always the story, right? But feel comfortable enough to share this process with you. So I hope some of this has been helpful. If hearing any of these pieces has moved you or led you to certain questions or comments in some ways, please do send me an email through my institutional email address. I am always looking for more videos to record, more ideas for stuff to talk about. So if you have a question related to this or a prompt, send it my way. It might make a really good topic or focus for a video. I'd love to record stuff on topics that's helpful to you all. Because again, I record all these videos that I post on my website for free and on my YouTube channel because I want to try and pay some of this forward. Because I benefited from really good mentoring, and I would not have gotten the sweet gig of a faculty job here at UK had I not been so privileged as to have good mentors. And so a lot of people are not in a position where they have a lot of good mentors around or access to that, and so I try and record as much of this stuff that I've learned over time in video format so that anybody can benefit from it. That feels important to try and level the playing field for folks, because we don't always have the same social capital, which is a form of socioeconomic status. We don't always get the benefit of having a lot of social capital and access to these mentors. So please feel free to send me your ideas, and I hope this was helpful. I'll see you next time.